The Ukraine war has been going on for 1,000 days, or 2 full years and 3/4 of a third year. This video will show the frontline change during those first 1,000 days. It will show all the biggest developments of the war and talk about how they impacted the frontline movements. It will give you a better insight into the history of the war so far, and perhaps even provide a hint of a trend for a future projection. 1,000 days have passed. Trump is gonna be the president again, and his stance on aid could impact overall support to Ukraine. So much is at stake, and today's sponsor, Ground News, is here to help you navigate the headlines. Ground News is an app and website that cuts through the media noise. It aggregates news from thousands of sources worldwide, so you can compare perspectives, track how different media sources shape the narrative, and see outlets' political leanings or ownership. Take the uncertainty around NATO's support for Ukraine under Trump. Almost 200 sources cover that story, allowing us to see how left, right, and center-leaning outlets frame the issue. Outlets like Kiev Independent argued that the war can't be stopped overnight, contradicting Trump's stance. Meanwhile, CNN highlights potential drastic cuts to US aid for Ukraine. Another great feature is the blind spot feed, which showcases stories that may be underreported by one side of the political spectrum. For example, this story on Putin's stance on Ukraine got far more coverage from the right-leaning media. Ground News ensures you don't miss such perspectives. As someone who needs a comprehensive understanding of global news, Ground News saves me time by summarizing diverse viewpoints on complex issues, whether I'm at my desk or on the go. Now, here's a special offer for Binkov viewers. Ground News is giving you 50% off their Vantage plan, which I use to access all the app's advanced features. This is their best deal of the year, available for a limited time. If you're already a subscriber, you can even gift Ground News to someone else for 50% off. I use my link in the video description, head to ground.news/Binkov or scan the QR code on the screen. Ground News makes it easy to stay informed. Give it a try. Of course, for many, the war started earlier in 2014, but these 1,000 days are counted from February 24, 2022, when Putin-led Russia launched another attack into Ukraine. First few days of the war were marked by mass confusion. What's happening? Where are the Russian forces? Where are Ukrainian defenses? Russian advances were swift, but one can tell that was in good part because of no Ukrainian reaction. Russians were traveling down the roads in big columns, with little opposition in certain parts of the country. Within just a few days, Russian forces were approaching Kiev. In the south, Kherson was reached. By day 3, Mykolaiv was reached, as well as Mariupol. But by the second week, Ukraine's forces had organized themselves, and blind rushing down the roads did not work anymore. Attacks and ambushes happened more and more, and before you know it, parts of the front largely stopped moving, like the Russian approach northwest of Kiev. Putin had hoped there would not even be real resistance and real war, only a quick military operation to change leadership in Kiev. But he was wrong. In the southwest, Russian troops surrounded Mariupol by March 2nd, connecting Crimea to a landmass via Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, which was one of vital goals. Yet a secondary goal. After the change of leadership proved impossible, it became the most important Russian mission. Large areas of Ukraine to the northeast were also taken by Russia, but again much of that was quick travels by road, not really firm control of the territory. Better control by the Russians was achieved north of Kharkiv and around Donbass, though there the Ukrainian lines fortified since 2014 held admirably, so no movement of the front line was observed there. As the aid from the West really started pouring in from March onward, with massive help in satellite imagery, surveillance and intelligence data, Ukraine managed to form firm lines and put those donated weapons like javelins and other systems to good use. Most of the little snakes on the front line, which show deep excursions of small Russian units by road, got in trouble, counterattacked by Ukraine, and a good deal of those progressions got cut one by one. March was a period of consolidation of the front line. Ukrainian forces let go of certain parts of the land, which were not defendable, like the far east of Kharkiv, also the land north of Mariupol, and even parts of the northern bank of the river Dnipro, north of Kherson. By the end of March, Russia saw that Ukraine's resistance was far greater and far more organized than they had hoped for, and that Russian forces sent into Ukraine were simply inadequate for the job of a real mass-scale war against Ukraine. Ukraine had started small-scale counterattacks by then, like near Kiev, Kherson and Sumy, so Putin made a decision to cut his losses. At the same time, by the start of April, Izium fell to Russians, and Russia started approaching the city of Severodonetsk. But more to the northwest, Russian forces swiftly retreated from the north of the country. By April 2nd, they were gone from around Kiev. By April 7th, they left northern Ukraine. We are talking about roughly half of Russian entire force in Ukraine. Those troops were gradually redistributed to other parts of the front line in Ukraine, in the east and in the south. At the same time, Russia further consolidated their gains north of Donbass and west of Kharkiv. But by then, we are talking late April and May already, Ukraine's forces were already much more numerous than Russian. Ukraine had mobilized 500,000 more people, and after several weeks of training, those started to take effect. With the starting military included, by late May, Ukraine had 700,000 troops, roughly 3 times as many troops as Russia. Most of the big Russian advances ground to a halt by May 2022. Ukraine successfully pushed Russians away from Kharkiv, reclaiming lots of territory. To the east, around Severodonetsk, Russia formed a cauldron where it could utilize its artillery superiority to a great degree, finally taking most of the city by June, and taking neighboring Lysychansk by July. Those were 2 fairly large cities of almost 100,000 citizens. Military and financial aid from the west was also pouring in greatly by then. First HIMARS rocket artillery systems were used in June 2022, enabling Ukraine to greatly leverage the intelligence info the West was supplying to it and hitting Russian targets deeper behind just the immediate front line. Despite those redistributed troops from the north, Russia lacked manpower and tried to put more soldiers into the fight. First mass paid recruitment of volunteers started that summer, as well as prisoners being sent to the front. But the figures mobilized that way were still in the thousands per month. It was not a proper effort, and Ukraine was starting to amass its forces. By now, several months into the war, those hundreds of thousands of additional Ukrainian troops received training and Western armaments had proliferated. July and August saw fairly little frontline movement. Russian gains got smaller and smaller as its initial forces, far too small for a mass-scale invasion, lost steam. It was a period of calm before the storm, before Ukraine launched its big 2022 offensives. By September 7th, the Ukrainian Kharkiv offensive was in full swing. It shattered through the Russian lines and discovered that the Russian lines were hollow. There were not enough reinforcements behind to hold said line. Russian forces east of Kharkiv fell apart quickly and basically fled within just several days. By 11th of September, the area around Kharkiv was freed of Russian presence. Late September saw further operations in the east, with Ukrainian forces approaching River Oskil, and at the same time a whole other contingent of Ukrainian forces started seeing success in the south. After a few months of probing attacks and pressure on Russian logistics, Russian lines north of Kherson started buckling. There, Western-sourced long-range precision artillery proved decisive, as it was keeping the logistics routes over the river Dnipro shut down. Basically, Russian forces north of Dnipro were systematically starved of supplies. The writing was on the wall for Russians, so on September 21st, Putin announced partial mobilization. Little over 300,000 troops were ultimately mobilized, but it would take months for those to come. In the meantime, by October 4th, a fair chunk of Russian-held territory near Kherson was reclaimed, with pressure mounting. By November, Ukrainian advance at the river Oskil up north was largely stopped after Russia finally consolidated their forces. But in the south, Russia could hold no more. During a few days leading to November 11th, Russian forces withdrew from the northern bank of Dnipro River, this time in a more organized fashion. From then on, the front was largely static for quite some time. Winter set in, and both sides were fairly exhausted, as Ukraine too suffered grave losses attacking. Russia was slowly adding those mobilized troops. It started to construct very sturdy defense lines, especially in the Zaporizhia region, and actually managed to take more land than Ukraine during December. Also, Russia kept slowly gaining towards the city of Bakhmut, capturing Soledar by early January 2023. On the other hand, Ukraine was preparing for another huge offensive. Those successful past offensives gave the West confidence to shower Ukraine with lots of new weapons and troop training offers. Ukraine timed the offensive for after the spring weather dried the land sufficiently for mass vehicle formations. By then, all those new units would be formed and ready to go. Early 2023 also saw the arrival of some novel weapons that would later on show to be quite impactful, like first-person drones and Russian precision glide bombs, but their numbers and significance was still limited at the start of 2023. Russians were pressing hard towards Bakhmut in those early months of 2023, with front movements so minuscule that they don't show well on this map. But Bakhmut was getting encircled. Other areas too were under Russian pressure, like near Vuhledar, a bit to the south, where Ukraine remained steadfast. North of Bakhmut, Russia slowly tried to retake some territory, with very limited success. Basically, most of the winter and spring of 2023 saw the front line come to a virtual standstill. Though after months and scores of casualties, Bakhmut itself started falling. But even that took a long time, with the last parts of the city being overtaken only in May. The events there would eventually lead to an open rebellion of Russia's largest private mercenary army, the Wagner Corps, possibly due to excessive Russian casualties and Russian leadership's handling of said casualties. The end result was dissolution of all mercenary armies in Russia. Ukraine actually saw some limited success pushing back those Russian forces in Bakhmut. One could say that was the start of Ukraine's big offensives, but Bakhmut itself was not reclaimed. Another direction of Ukrainian offensive was near Velka Novosilka, where again limited success was seen. But perhaps the most publicized push was made south of Orikhiv, where some Russian defensive lines were eventually breached, but not fully. By July, it was becoming apparent the pace of Ukrainian progress was too slow and losses were too costly. By August, the offensive was running out of steam. The thing is, Russia had prepared well for defense. Not only did it have months to construct complex defenses, but the late 2022 mobilization of fresh troops was just the start. Russia also started paying serious money to contract soldiers, luring tens of thousands of fresh troops per month. By mid-2023, Russia probably added close to 500,000 more troops, all in all, compared to the end of 2022, though not all could be deployed to Ukraine. Both sides also changed their economies and industry to a war footing, but Russia's is several times larger, and perhaps crucially, Ukrainian air defenses were running out of missiles at one point in early 2023, allowing Russia to gain some foothold with their mass-produced recon drones, which in turn enabled Russia to monitor the front lines and be warned of upcoming Ukrainian attacks. Several NATO weapon types reached Ukraine during 2023, including the Patriot SAM system, stealth cruise missiles, NATO's heavy tanks such as Leopards and Abramses, and even ATACMS missiles near the end of the year. But all those were available in fairly low numbers, not really enough to make an impact. FPV drones and Russian glide bombs were becoming ubiquitous on the battlefield, fielded in much larger numbers. Ukraine was also continuously short on fired artillery rounds, almost always trailing behind Russia by a factor or 2, 3 or more. In October, some Ukrainian troops crossed the river Dnipro, south of Kherson, but it ended up being more of a political show rather than a significant push into Russian lines. Dnipro is really too wide for a large force to cross and be supplied easily. It presents a natural defensive barrier. Around the same time in Donbass, Russians started pushing more towards Avdiivka, as well as pushing back around Bakhmut, but the fruits of those attacks would show only months later. Also, US military aid largely dried up by October, as US political infighting did not allow for more aid to be sent. that would go on for months and leave a visible impact on Ukraine. By November, the pace of Russian gains slowly started to pick up. That was the start of a trend that would hardly let up. Unlike Russia, who was still managing to recruit a few tens of thousands of troops per month, Ukraine was finding it hard to match their numbers and was falling behind in troop levels. It was still unwilling to broaden the scope of its mobilization due to internal politics. Ukrainian morale, which was once a strong point of the Ukrainian military, was dipping. Russia was making very small, slow gains on several points along the Eastern Front. By February, Avdiivka was all but surrounded. It fell on February 17th. Russia kept pushing. During February, it took over 100 square kilometers of area. It was the most territory it took in a single month since February 2023, a year ago. Russian gains slowed down during March as they recuperated after heavy losses near Avdiivka. In April, Russian gains again increased pace. Ukraine was really behind in artillery shells by then, firing 5 times fewer shells than Russia. Around that time, the US Congress voted for continued aid. Said aid would start coming in within weeks. In May, Ukraine finally started another wider round of mobilization after months of political infighting preventing said move. Effects of the mobilization would need a few months to be seen. By May, Russia was also expanding its gains both beyond Avdiivka and towards Chasiv Yar. On May 10th, Russia also utilized its numerical advantage and opened up a new front, attacking north of Kharkiv from Russian territory. There was little Ukrainian defense set up there, so the initial Russian advance was quick. By June, that Russian offensive stalled, but still likely managed to spread out the already thinly manned Ukrainian units. Mid-June saw Russia start their attack on city of Toretsk. July saw further Russian advances, slow and small scale but relentless, and covering everywhere from the northeast close to Kupiansk to some probing attacks in the south, seeking to retake that Ukrainian pocket south of Orikhiv. As Russia was inching ever closer to the city of Pokrovsk, Ukraine decided to open up a completely new front, hoping to utilize their best troops better, surprise the Russians, and force them to redirect their troops. So at the start of August, it launched an attack into Russian territory in the region of Kursk. Initial gains were swift and large, as Russia was caught off guard. Russia did divert some troops to Kursk, but not too many and seemingly not from the Donbas region, choosing to prioritize their Donbas advance over swiftly counterattacking in Kursk. August saw gradual buckling of Ukrainian defenses in the east, with Russia taking double the territory area compared to July. Ukraine was retreating from mid-sized towns like Novokhodivka, which fell in late August. Ukraine was seemingly so low on manpower that even urban defenses were not something it could utilize. Ukraine's advances in Kursk largely stopped by mid-September. Ukraine was still behind in artillery shells, and Russian air superiority over the front line continued. Up north, Russian advances towards Oskil River Reservoir also became more noticeable. By October 1st, Vuhledar fell, which was guarding the entrance to the plains behind it. Russia started taking even more territory, with monthly gains increasing yet again. Ukrainian lands in Kursk were chipped away at, as were Ukrainian front lines in Donbas, especially south of Pokrovsk. Russian missile attacks have increased throughout the year, chipping away at Ukrainian logistics behind the front line. October saw yet again the biggest Russian gains in Ukraine since basically the start of the war. By late October, Russia reached the Oskil River Reservoir up north. Ukrainian pockets of resistance west of Donetsk were also closed fairly quickly. Russia amassed sizable troops in Kursk as well in early September, starting another counterattack on Ukrainians there. By mid-November, Russians also reached the city of Kupiansk, once again threatening it, after Ukraine reclaimed it 2 years earlier. The US also decided to let Ukraine use ballistic missiles on Russia proper. It's too early to say what the effects of that will be. Which brings us to today, the first 1,000 days of the war. Right now, situation is not good for Ukraine. Monthly influx of fresh Russian troops seems to have abated by now, potentially matched by fresh Ukrainian troops per month. But results of that change remain to be seen. North Korea may have also sent some troops to fight alongside Russians in Kursk. Russian advances in the southeast are accelerating. The future is hard to see, but with the imminent change of leadership in the US and war weariness setting in, it's possible we will see the end of the war sometime soon. Aid from Western countries has not really increased over the years. It can even be argued it slowed down during 2024, while Russian industry increased its war production several-fold. But in heavy weapons committed, a drop in aid is definitely visible. It's not that the West started giving that much fewer stuff overall, but the composition of aid changed. F-16s and SAM systems have taken place of other equipment like tanks. War in Ukraine is already one of the longest high-intensity conflicts in modern history. The Korean War, for example, lasted for 3 years and 1 month. The Ukraine War is looking likely to last longer than that. World War I lasted for 4 years and 3 months, which is not that far away actually. It's possible Ukraine War might reach that grim milestone as well. But the end may also be near. What will that end result of the war be, however? Well, that's a different matter entirely. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.